The initial frost had yet to touch the distant corners of Carbon County, but the chill was already making its slow descent from the mountains. By the end of October, the aspens had become pale and fragile, while the atmosphere carried a sharp stillness that caused dogs to whimper in their sleep and windmill blades to groan like fading spirits. Jack Miller no longer paid much attention to the cold, not because he had adapted to it, but because it no longer held any power over him. At 44, he dwelled alone in a structure that had once been a freight wagon, later used as a field infirmary during wartime, then a refuge for Cheyenne scouts on the border, and now, at last, his dwelling, if a man like him could still assert that word. The wagon leaned unevenly among rusted farming equipment and a half-destroyed shed, encircled by cracked soil, low, rolling hills, and crows gliding low through the air in dark arcs, resembling symbols from a lost language. No one ventured this far north unless they were fleeing something or owed debts to someone more terrifying than death itself. Jack Miller was neither running nor indebted to anyone. He moved silently through the valleys, exchanging pelts and dried meat with the Lakota widow living on the eastern border of the pass, and fixed the barbed wire fences of abandoned farms nearby whenever the wind tore them apart. He only spoke when absolutely necessary. He drank only when his hands trembled from the cold or haunting dreams. Although he kept a small pistol loaded and concealed beneath his bedroll, he had not fired it in 5 years, ever since the man wearing a red vest and a silver tooth came hunting for a bounty and left with a broken kneecap and a bloody trail leading into the ravine. The residents of the nearest settlement, called Hartley Ridge, with a population hardly reaching 35 when the skies were clear, referred to Jack Miller as a watchman, not because he guarded anyone, but because he observed everything around him. Tales were shared about him, that once he cut a man's throat using a shattered spur, that he had spoken Comanche fluently until part of his tongue was severed, and that he slept with one eye open while keeping the other hidden inside a box beneath the floorboards. Jack paid no attention to these rumors. The more others dreaded him, the less they tried to drag him into their trivial affairs. He had been involved before. 6 years earlier, he had buried a woman on a hillside, her name eroded from the stone due to crude engraving and harsh weather. He had also lost a child, so tiny it fit in the palm of his hand, wrapped in cloth and already cold. No grief remained within him, only endless days, one following another. That was the reason Jack Miller had come to town that October, an ordinary trip. He needed tobacco, salt, flint, and axle grease. He always arrived close to closing time when the tavern buzzed with noise and the general store was nearly bare, when the preacher drowned himself in drink and the blacksmith's dog had settled into the ashes. Jack moved through town like a mist, seen but ignored. However, on this specific evening as he crossed the square, something made him halt midway. There was no sound or voice, just a sudden break in the scenery. A cage. Not a proper one, but a makeshift prison fashioned from a pig pen's frame and chicken wire, placed atop a buckboard wagon with muddy wheels sunk about half a foot into the dirt. Inside the cage were 2 figures, a teenage girl, no older than 16, barefoot and expressionless, and a baby wrapped in a torn petticoat, softly crying like a calf dying of thirst. The woman standing next to the wagon had once possessed a beauty as sharp and dangerous as a blade, designed to wound. However, now her hair was greasy, her lips stained with saliva, and her hands clutched a bottle of cheap bourbon as if it were her only salvation. She yelled at the crowd, mostly drifters and ranch workers seeking amusement. "They are both mine. I swear by the Lord who watches everything." I gave birth to her in the back of a hay wagon and him in a ditch during a storm. My womb surrendered better than my heart ever did. I have no use for either now. They eat, they cry, they stink. I want whiskey, not mouths." Laughter burst out from the crowd. Someone threw a coin. Another yelled, "Do you take silver or bullets, Linda?" The baby's crying grew louder, not from fear but hunger. Long, drawn-out wails that sent chills down the spine. The girl remained silent. She sat perfectly still, one arm wrapped around the child, the other limp on her knee. Her eyes showed no desperation, nor were they lifeless. They were calculating, like she had already considered every possible way this moment could fail and was patiently waiting for the final outcome. Jack Miller did not move forward, not just yet. From his spot across the square, he observed quietly, his hand resting lightly on the sack of nails tucked inside his coat. He did not know the young woman, nor the boy beside her, yet something stirred deep in his chest, perhaps an ancient instinct or a scar that never fully mended. The crowd slowly began to disperse. The woman raised her voice once more, slurring her words. "I will buy 1 jug, just 1. Heck, I will even mention the name of the father if that makes it better." No one answered. The spectacle had ended. People had found their sick entertainment and were moving along. The young woman, however, remained rooted in place. Her eyes stayed steady, not pleading, not performing, simply enduring. When Jack started to turn away, she did something unexpected. She leaned forward, pressed her lips gently to the baby's forehead, and then fixed her gaze on him. Not as if she recognized him, but as if she had chosen him. As though, among all the torment she had endured in life, this was her final conscious gesture, to make someone truly see her and understand that she had neither screamed nor begged nor fallen to her knees. That gaze trailed Jack all the way back to his wagon. It followed him through the night as the fire hissed and he cleaned the rifle untouched since 1982. It lingered when the crows refused to settle near his cabin the following morning, and it stayed when he opened the door to find something beyond explanation. A baby basket wrapped in a tobacco sack lying on the frost-crusted earth. Inside lay the infant, eyes wide open, breathing shallow, arms twitching. No message, no trace of the woman, only a blood-stained handkerchief tied to the basket's side. Next to it on the ground rested his own knife, the very one missing for months, spotless, neatly placed, somehow as if awaiting him. By the time Jack carried the infant indoors, frost was creeping up the windows like spectral fingers from another realm. He wrapped the child gently in a woolen shirt and set him close to the stove where warmth seeped slowly from the iron. The baby, thin, bearing a red mark that curled down his left cheek like a question, barely moved, his breath so faint Jack had to check his pulse twice to be certain it was there. He had witnessed children perish more silently than rabbits, especially when they gave up hope for anyone to answer their cries. Jack had no milk, no comforting touch, no cradle, no soothing words, only boiled water, softened bits of jerky, and silence. Yet the boy accepted it all, swallowing what was offered before falling into a still sleep that reminded Jack of too many cold winter mornings spent on distant battlefields. The girl, however, had disappeared. For a moment, Jack thought she had forsaken the child, abandoned the basket like a heavy stone and fled into the night, choosing hunger over the burden of a stranger's mercy. But then he spotted a thin line of blood along the porch railing, careful and precise, as if someone had wiped a blade clean. He walked outside, feeling the air sharp enough to burn his lungs. The footprints were easy to track, not in this dry, powdery snow. They headed north toward the old ravine where wolves had been seen 2 nights ago. He hurried, driven not by fear, but by determination. Yet, it was still her he found first. She crouched behind a fallen cedar tree, her hands coated with dirt, eyes wide but not frenzied. Nearby, face down and groaning, lay a man, one of the drifters from Hartley Ridge. His shoulder was ripped open, blood seeping into the ground. Jack Miller didn't ask questions. The girl did not provide any answers. When she noticed him, she slowly stood up, one hand still clutching a dull, rusty hatchet. Her dress was torn at the neckline. One corner of her lip was split. She looked at him as if she were already halfway out of this world, as if she never expected anyone to follow or find her, or even care. Jack said nothing. He stepped past her and rolled the man onto his back. Recognition struck hard. The man was Maynard, a known cheat at cards, occasional cattle thief, and the kind of scoundrel who always grinned too broadly at girls who never returned the smile. Jack checked his pulse. He was still alive. He looked back at the girl who was now trembling, not from fear, but exhaustion as adrenaline faded. Slowly, Jack reached out and took the hatchet from her grasp. She released it without protest. Jack did not ask whether Maynard had tried to harm her. There was no need. The answer was clear in the way her shoulders tensed and the tight line of her mouth. Jack dragged the wounded man toward the edge of the ravine and left him there, half covered with snow, still breathing, not out of kindness, but as a warning. Hartley Ridge would find him, and they would understand what had happened. Back near the wagon, the child remained asleep, his tiny fingers curled into little fists. Jack placed a blanket over the girl and indicated the pot of stew. She did not eat immediately. Instead, she sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the stove as though it were a sacred place, and she awaited a sign to comfort her spirit. After some time, she lifted a spoon and began to eat. Her bites were small and deliberate. When she finished, she rose without being asked, fetched water from the barrel, and cleaned the bowl herself. Then she sat back down and waited. Jack observed her thoughtfully, curious about who might have taught her to behave like that, like a servant, unnoticed, helpful, and silent. It was not obedience, it was survival. She had learned to appear harmless, knowing that innocent girls were less prone to punishment. Jack had witnessed this before. As the wind roared against the wagon's creaking wooden frame and the fire dwindled into glowing red coals, she reached into her coat and took out a small piece of cloth, a square torn from another person's shirt, and carefully unfolded it. Inside were 2 items, a solitary hair ribbon and a silver button. She handled them as if they were precious artifacts. Jack Miller did not ask questions. He sat opposite her, busy sharpening a knife. The quiet between them was neither soothing nor harsh. It simply existed. After a while, she broke the silence, not with a voice soft from fear, but steady, as if reciting a list she had gone over too often. His name is Jamie. He is 8 months old. He does not sleep well when it is noisy. He will drink goat's milk if it is warm, and if you hum, he settles down more quickly. Jack paused his work. She went on. He is not ill, but he never cries loudly, only softly, like he is scared to make a sound. Her voice trembled a little, yet she kept going. Linda used to shake him when he cried. One time, she left him outside overnight. She said if he wanted to be alive, he had to prove it. Jack Miller let out a slow breath through his nose. Words would not be enough in this moment. He gave a single nod, set the blade down, and rose to his feet. From the chest, he took out a saddle blanket and handed it to her. As she wrapped it gently around her shoulders, he spoke softly. "Do you have a name?" She met his gaze for a long while, a kind of silence that most avoid. Finally, she spoke in a whisper. "Sarah." That was all. No surname, no further details. Jack did not press. He only nodded once more and repeated her name quietly. It felt like laying the first stone in a foundation neither had intended to create. The following day, news spread across town that Maynard had been located. Still alive, half frozen, and speaking nonsense. He recounted a strange tale involving a girl, a child, and a scarred man who carried a crow on his shoulder and never blinked. Many townsfolk dismissed the story. Some looked on with suspicion. The sheriff asked a few questions cautiously, keeping his voice low. Nobody wished to stir up trouble with the man in the wagon, especially since trouble often came with sharp teeth. Yet the trouble arrived regardless. 3 evenings later, Jack Miller returned from the ridge carrying rabbit meat and noticed the wagon door ajar, the fire burning low. Inside, Linda stood gripping a shotgun aimed downward, her hands trembling. Before her, a man was tied to the table leg with rope from Jack's tack. His face bore bruises. A knife lay discarded on the floor near him. "He came looking," she explained. "Said I owed him. Said Jamie isn't mine. Said I was only the one who stayed." Her tone did not rise. It fell like ice sinking in the thaw of spring. Jack did not question the truth of her words. It was irrelevant. What mattered was she had not fled. She had not screamed. She had protected a child with rope, steel, and her bare hands. Jack untied the man, dragged him outside, and left him lying in the dirt, his nose broken with a clear warning not to return north. That was the final attempt anyone made to take Jamie. Yet, it was not the last time someone sought to steal the truth. Later, as the boy slept and Linda braided a strip of cloth into a makeshift cord, Jack asked a question he had not planned to voice. "Why him?" She looked up, puzzled. "Jamie, why keep him? You could have left him." Her hands stopped moving. She remained silent for a while. Then, softly, she said, "Because he doesn't know how to leave me. And that means I can't leave him." In that moment, Jack, who once buried a daughter he never knew, understood more than words could express. That evening marked the beginning of the crib's construction. Not made from ordinary pine or wood bought at a store. Instead, he used cedar boards he had preserved from the old house that had burned down years before, a place he never mentioned. Each nail hammered into that crib carried a weight of reckoning. Each carved mark was a promise. When he finally finished, he placed Jamie inside and watched as the boy's small hands gripped the edge tightly, like roots seeking nourishment in the earth. Linda offered a smile, the first genuine one. It was neither broad nor luminous, but it was sincere. That night changed everything. They were no longer just strangers bound together by chance. They had become something different. Not exactly a family, yet close enough to feel pain if it were ever torn apart. Winter had yet to fully dig its claws into the earth, but its touch had already reached the very core of the land. The daylight hours were now diminished, edged with chilling winds carrying the aromas of stone and aged ash, while the nights arrived swiftly as if a thief had come back to the scene of its crime. Inside the wagon, the air grew heavy, with the smell of coal smoke and the warmth of two bodies learning to coexist in the same confined space. Jack Miller moved in his usual manner, deliberate and quiet, with the stance of a man who thought walls should not overhear secrets and company should not overstay. However, there was a subtle change in the way he now opened the door more cautiously, as though he was listening first, or how he habitually left the fire burning brightly before stepping out to draw water from the partly frozen stream. Linda, on her side, maintained her distance, yet the silence between them gained a new presence. It carried weight and form, even a peculiar rhythm, like wind sweeping across a canvas that had finally been stretched tight after hanging loose for far too long. She had started to speak more frequently. Not a lot, not regularly, but when she did, her words held the conviction of someone who had mastered the art of survival through hardship. She understood how to butcher a rabbit, prepare healing poultices using moss found under birch trees, and weave cords sturdy enough to restrain a grown man's wrist. Jack Miller observed her movements. They were not those of a girl taught only household tasks, but of someone brought up amid tools, flames, and suffering. She possessed the skill to disappear into a room and still perceive every single motion within it. She always kept the child close, either securely fastened to her body or cradled in a sling she crafted from an old saddle blanket. Yet there were times when she placed him in the crib Jack had made and looked at him for a long while, as though committing his image to memory in case she needed to leave once more. Then the snow arrived. Not the gentle kind that softly promises calm, but the heavy, relentless kind that swallowed fences whole and transformed roads into icy white pathways of danger. Jack Miller had left early to check the traps and stayed out longer than usual. When he finally came back, soaked to his waist and limping slightly from slipping on a stone, he saw Linda on top of the wagon roof, hammer in hand, sealing a leak with tar and strips of hide. The baby was inside, safe and asleep by the fire. She stood alone up there, her hair glued to her forehead, skin pale from the cold, but her jaw firm as rock. Jack did not ask how she had managed to climb up. He did not question how she knew exactly where the leak was. He simply handed her another nail and steadied the ladder while she kept working. That evening, a fracture broke the quiet. Linda was near the stove, unwrapping dried meat with hands shaking from the chill, when she spoke. "I broke a man's leg once. Not Maynard. It was someone else. He tried to own me. Believed that if he paid enough, I would stop resisting. I didn't." Jack stayed silent, pouring hot water into 2 tin cups. She avoided his gaze, continuing with a voice rough and raw as scraped wood. "They believe that if you seem small, you will stay weak. But even rabbits bite when their home is invaded." Jack passed her a cup. Their fingers touched briefly. Neither of them pulled away. Then came the night that almost unraveled everything. Jamie had begun coughing, a harsh, phlegmy cough that shook his small ribs and turned his rest into soft whimpers. Sarah hardly found any sleep. She stayed upright beside the crib, giving him tiny spoonfuls of water boiled with pine bark and salt. Jack Miller brought her herbs from the hill, ones he remembered his wife using long ago before her lungs failed. Sarah never questioned him, only crushed the herbs into poultices, applied them to the child's chest, and sang in a voice so quiet it was almost a breath. One of those nights, when snow was heaped like a sentence against the door, she reached out and touched Jack's sleeve as he handed her the kettle. It was not a grab or hold, simply the tips of her fingers resting on his forearm, like a silent thought yet to be spoken. He looked down at her, and for the first time she met his gaze. Her eyes, rimmed red with exhaustion, held something deep and unusual. Thankfulness mingled with caution, sorrow entwined with resistance. She said softly, "He is improving. You gave me time." Jack stayed silent, unable to speak. Instead, he placed the kettle down, sat beside her on the floor, and together they listened to the baby's breathing, treasuring the sound as if it was something precious to protect. The following day, the wind had settled and the snow had hardened into rough, icy layers. Jack stepped outside to clear the path and inspect the shed. He came back to find Linda not inside the wagon, but crouched low in the snow behind it, her rifle resting across her knees. When he moved closer, she gestured toward the trees. "Riders," she whispered. There were 2 or maybe 3, too distant to make out clearly, yet close enough to demand attention. Jack stayed calm. He took the rifle from her hands, examined the chamber, and then put it aside. "Get inside," he instructed. "You and the boy." She hesitated. "I can shoot," she said quietly. "I know," he answered, "but if things go wrong, you won't be the one they remember." The riders did not come closer. They waited near the tree line for about half an hour, then disappeared along the path they had arrived by. Jack kept his eyes on them until they vanished, then spent the rest of the day resetting traps, one hand always resting on his revolver. Later that night, as Linda mended a rip in Jamie's blanket, she said, "They weren't just keeping watch, they were assessing, deciding if we're worth their effort." Jack simply nodded. Let them wonder. It had become evident that they were not as concealed as they had once believed. Consequently, decisions had to be made. The wagon was too cramped and delicate to withstand a siege. Although the cabin Jack Miller had lived in before was destroyed by fire, its stone base still remained down in the valley. Jack suggested rebuilding it, not as a permanent residence, but for protection. Linda consented, and over the next several days they transported stone and timber through the snow, shaping a shelter from the wilderness that might, if fortune smiled upon them, turn into their refuge. The labor was exhausting, harsh, unyielding, and merciless. But Linda never voiced a single complaint. She carried loads of stone, twice her own weight, chopped wood until her palms were raw, and each night placed Jamie gently on a folded quilt near the unfinished fireplace. One evening, after dusting snow off her coat and sitting by the fire, she confided, "I thought surviving meant staying still, being quiet, making yourself small. Now I believe it might be about creating something they cannot take away from you." Jack looked at her then, not as a protector, nor as a man seeking redemption, but as someone recognizing an impending storm and choosing to face it head on. Later that night, once the baby had fallen asleep and the fire had diminished to glowing embers, Jack took a piece of chalk and marked a line across the wooden beam above the door. When Linda asked about it, he said, "This marks the first day of something that belongs to us, not merely what was left behind." In that instant, she rose and did something neither expected. She reached up to draw a second line next to his. "Then we count together," she said. It was not a vow of trust nor an expression of love, but it marked their first shared action unrelated to escape or fleeing. For individuals like them, this quiet moment carried weight beyond words either dared to voice. Winter grew harsher, its silence feeling more like condemnation than calm, pressing heavily over the land until even the wind faltered between its breaths. The cabin, only half finished, looked like a dark wound against the white drifts, its stone walls barely at waist height, the roof merely a skeleton of pine logs and frozen hopes. Still, Jack Miller and Sarah returned daily, carrying what they could, enduring cold that bit through boots straight to their bones. Jamie's coughing had mostly ceased. Although his rest was still restless, he ate better, his cheeks faintly tinted with color, and he began to reach deliberately with tiny hands stretching toward the firelight, the folds of Linda's coat, the hem of Jack's sleeve. He made no sound during this, no soft coos or cries, only breaths and movement, as if a spirit was cautiously learning to inhabit a body. Jack Miller observed him more frequently these days, not out of worry, but with an unfamiliar, reluctant tenderness he concealed behind rough hands and quiet excuses. The boy was not his own, carried no share of his bloodline or heritage, yet whenever Jamie pressed his face against Jack's chest, the man hesitated just a moment too long, as if scared to move, fearing the child might disappear like a wisp of smoke. One evening, the sky changed in that strange way it always did before the fiercest storms. Its color faded, the air grew unnaturally still, and the silence was so profound it seemed as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Jack was the first to notice. He paused with his axe raised above a block of ice-hardened wood, eyes fixed on the horizon. There was no motion, no bird song, no breeze, only a weight pressing against his ears. He let the axe fall without completing the strike. Inside the wagon, Linda was boiling cloth and slicing dried roots into strips to brew tea. Jack entered without a word and started fastening the shutters, stuffing worn rags tightly into the door frame. Linda didn't question him. She simply turned down the stove, wrapped Jamie closer in his sling, and pulled on her boots. That was how things had become. Warnings were unnecessary. They understood. Yet they could not have known that everything would change so swiftly. Within 60 minutes, snow began falling. Not gentle flakes, but hard and sharp granules that stung upon contact and sizzled as they hit the ground. The temperature plunged rapidly. The trees creaked under ice they had not supported for many decades. Then, just as darkness swallowed the ridges, the wind arrived. Not a howl, but a piercing scream, sudden and full-throated, tearing across the land as if dragging something behind it. The stove fire flickered uncertainly. The wagon groaned under the strain. Jamie whimpered softly, clutching tightly to Sarah's chest. Jack Miller muttered curses beneath his breath, slipped on his coat and stepped outside with the lantern swinging at his side. The shed's roof rattled violently. He reached halfway there before a gust snatched the lantern and smashed it against the frozen wall. In total darkness, he reached the shed and began securing whatever he could. Ropes, pelts, the drying rack. Then came a crack. Not like thunder or a breaking branch, but something profound. The ground itself trembled. Jack turned and spotted the chaos. The stovepipe, torn loose by the wind, had slammed backward into the wagon, scattering sparks. Flames leapt instantly as dry wood and pitch caught fire without delay. He sprinted. Linda was already outside. Jamie held close in her arms, her hair wild and eyes glowing with reflected fire. Jack grabbed her elbow to pull her away, just as the heat radiated outward. The wagon groaned loudly, then collapsed. It did not explode, but simply folded inward as though crushed by the weight of a fading memory. Everything inside, bedding, food supplies, tools, the crib, was lost. They remained silent. There was nothing left to say. In the blazing light, with the snow turning into a fierce blizzard and the wind howling like a curse, Jack Miller pointed toward the cabin. It had no roof, only stone walls. It offered some protection from the wind, though not from the cold. They hurried forward, Jamie nestled tightly between them, his small frame silent yet warm. They arrived just as the wind tore the last wooden plank from the wagon's frame, sending it crashing to the ground. Inside the rough cabin, Jack sparked a small fire using the dry kindling he had hidden beneath the stone floor. The smoke hung low, but the flames did burn. Linda crouched in the corner. Jamie pressed against her chest, and for the first time since that night they met, she seemed scared. Not angry or defensive, just vulnerable and real. Jack settled beside her, took off his coat, and wrapped it around both of them. For a while, they remained quietly watchful as the wind tried to seep through the stone walls, and the snow hissed against the broken frame overhead. Then her voice barely rose above a whisper. "I always believed when it burned, I would feel free." He turned toward her. "The wagon?" She shook her head. "The past." Jack closed his eyes. His hands still carried the smell of smoke. His bones ached in that familiar way from the war, the kind of pain that meant survival, but with parts left behind in the frozen wasteland. He reached out, hesitated, and then gently laid his hand on Jamie's back. The boy shifted slightly. Linda did not pull away. She said, "I named him after a ghost." Jack did not ask which one. She did not explain. Outside, the wind faded just before dawn. Inside, the fire barely flickered on. In that moment, suspended between ruin and dawn, something shifted once more. Not with loud cries, not with grand announcements, but softly, like roots creeping beneath frozen earth. Calm, relentless, unavoidable. They had lost everything they possessed. Yet, they still held on to one another. Not yet. The days after the blaze melted into a routine that resembled survival far more than recovery. The half-finished cabin stood as their sole refuge, lacking a roof but steady against the wind, with furs draped over the rafters and tarps stretched across the beams to keep out the snow. Jack strengthened the walls, hammering nails into ice-cold timber with fingers numb from the chill, while Linda melted snow for water and showed Jamie how to drink from a tin cup with a handle she had carved. Their provisions had vanished. No flour, no salt, only what Jack could trap and what Linda managed to create from bark and roots. Hunger was not unfamiliar to them, but it now felt harsher, more impatient, the kind that lightens sleep and quickens irritability. Despite everything, there were still moments filled with quiet tenderness. Jamie started to crawl, awkward and slow, across the animal hides, his small hands reaching toward the comforting heat of the fire or the edge of Jack Miller's boot. On one occasion, Jack noticed him gnawing on a discarded bullet casing and did not reprimand him, simply swapping it for a strip of dried meat and mumbling, "It's best to recognize danger early on." Linda chuckled at that. Soft, unexpected laughter, rough from disuse. At that instant, Jack realized it had been more than a year since he last heard genuine laughter. Not since the night the river froze completely and swallowed the last of his mules beneath the ice. However, the world beyond their fragile refuge had not forgotten them. It was shifting, growing uneasy. It started with murmurs in Hartley Ridge, barely audible at first, whispers that clung to tavern corners and traveled alongside supply wagons. Maynard, only half recovered and twice as bitter, began spreading tales once again. Stories about the girl with the knife and the infant she insisted was not hers. About the man with lifeless eyes and silence as dark as crows who abandoned him bleeding in the snow. People listened, then dismissed it with a scoff, only to listen once more. Because repeated stories breed doubt, and doubt demands someone to blame. By the time the first thaw of spring transformed the paths into muddy streams, the rumors had gained weight. The preacher's wife insisted she had spotted Linda in town years ago, already expecting, although no man had ever stepped forward. The general store clerk murmured that Jack Miller once held a baby as if it were a heavy stone, not in the way a man should carry a child. The elderly women near the boarding house remembered how Linda was cast out from her mother's house. Her name erased from the family Bible. Nobody asked why. No one considered what it cost a girl to be wiped away like that. They simply recalled the silence and filled it with dread. Then the preacher himself arrived. With one eye, his white beard, and a voice thick with scripture and sharpness, he climbed the mountain trail on a borrowed mule, clutching a Bible in one hand and a petition in the other. He found Jack cutting wood and skipped the usual greetings. "You have taken in a prostitute and an illegitimate child, Mr. Miller," he stated bluntly, "and this is a blot your county cannot bear." Jack kept chopping, never glancing his way. The preacher continued, "People are uneasy. They say the boy is cursed, that he does not cry, that she never sleeps, that wolves gather near your cabin as dusk falls." He paused, adjusted the mule's reins. "They want them removed, sent to the mission, maybe, or returned to where she came from. You're free to remain, of course. No one seeks trouble, only peace." Jack Miller swung the axe, cleaving a log effortlessly, then remarked, "Have you ever come across the part where Christ said, 'Let the little children come to me'?" The preacher sneered, replying, "Not when they are born with sin." Jack looked up slowly, eyes sharp. "Then you ought to read it again. The entire passage, not just the parts that justify your cowardice." The preacher departed, but his exit was anything but quiet. By the end of the week, a small group arrived. 3 men and 2 women dressed in their Sunday best, their faces bearing the kind of grim looks that always hid a self-righteous kind of fear. Linda spotted them first. She was softly singing while bathing Jamie in a wooden basin outside when she noticed a flicker of motion beyond the trees. She did not scream or run. Instead, she wrapped the baby, handed him to Jack, and grabbed the rifle, leaning against a nearby stump. At first, they did not draw weapons. They attempted politeness, talking about the welfare of the community, disturbance among respectable families, and concerns over unnatural conduct. They politely asked once if Linda would consider leaving. They claimed she frightened the animals, that dogs barked endlessly when she walked by, and that the air around her felt wrong. Linda stood silently, the rifle pointed at the ground. When they finished speaking, Jack asked one question. "Which one of you intends to take the child from her arms?" No one replied. He stepped forward with Jamie cradled in one arm, his other hand resting on the knife at his belt. She carried him through the cold season, nourished him even when her own strength was gone, stood by him when the flames erased everything. You believe some godless decree gives you the right to take that away from her? His tone was quiet but powerful. "If you want him, come and take him. But I warn you, there will be no mercy, only graves." They departed. Not all of them did so willingly. For a while, the mountain fell silent once more. Yet silence is never true peace. It is merely a pause before the scream. One night, as distant thunder rumbled and the wind brought the smell of damp ash, Jamie suddenly began to cry. Not softly, nor from hunger, but a fierce wail that shook his small frame and flushed his face deep red. He did not stop. Linda rocked him, sang softly, offered warm milk and cool cloths, whispered prayers she had not spoken since childhood. Nothing eased him. Jack raised the fire, checked for fever, injuries, or broken bones. Jamie cried on and on until, abruptly, he ceased. Too abruptly. His body went slack, not lifeless, but far away, as if something inside had switched off. Jack held him, heart hammering with uncertainty over what he was seeing. Linda took Jamie back gently, laid him down, placed her ear against his chest, then murmured, "He is in shock." Then, as if moved by an unseen force, she rose and headed to the cabin's rear, beginning to pry stones from the floor. Jack Miller did not realize until Linda revealed the bundle. Fabric, worn and old, wrapped in waxed paper and tied carefully with twine. Inside was a photograph, a man with a strong jawline, dressed in uniform, his eyes bearing a striking resemblance to Jamie's. On the back, a name was scribbled in trembling ink. Ben Tillman, July 5th, 1885. Linda handed it to Jack and explained, "That was his father. He died in a mining accident in Missouri. They erased his name, claimed he was unworthy. My family said I was imagining things, told me I had fallen under a ghost spell." She knelt down beside Jamie and added, "He is not cursed. He is mourning someone he never knew, just like me." Jack remained silent. He simply sat next to her and, saying nothing, placed his hand gently on Jamie's chest, and waited. That night, the boy moved. His hand closed softly around Jack's thumb. Linda, with dry yet reddened eyes, murmured, "You cannot repair what people fear, but you can outlast it." And for the first time, Jack believed she was right. Spring arrived with its typical fierceness, flooding the riverbeds, cracking rocks as the freeze thawed, breaking branches as if they were fragile bones. The valley throbbed with new life, yet higher up on the hills, the ground stayed stubbornly firm, and the frost lingered like an unwelcome memory. Jack Miller had finally constructed a solid roof over the cabin, angled and sealed with tar, using beams reclaimed from the abandoned mill. Linda had sowed a row of early potatoes in a shallow trench behind the barn. Little Jamie, now walking with the unsteady gait of a young foal, wandered aimlessly around the fire pit, sometimes dragging a stick behind him, sometimes clutching a tin cup as if it were priceless. They were crafting a semblance of normalcy, even though the air still carried the faint smell of charred wood. Yet both understood that this calm was temporary and fragile. The quiet was shattered one morning by the sound of hooves striking wet stone. A sharp rhythm, too many to be mere travelers, too deliberate to be merchants. Jack stood on the cabin porch, a rifle slung across his chest, while Linda silently led Jamie indoors. 4 riders appeared in the clearing, each clad in tan coats with spurs jingling, guns resting loosely at their sides. They bore no official badges, yet exuded the unmistakable weight of someone used to wielding power, perhaps self-appointed, but commanding nonetheless. The foremost rider, a stocky man bearing a scar along his temple and a star pinned to his vest, dismounted slowly and stepped forward. "Are you Jack Miller?" the man asked, his voice rough and soaked with the bitterness of whiskey. Jack gave a single nod. The stranger motioned to the men behind him. "These fellows are acting under territorial authority. That woman in your cabin, she is charged, theft, rebellion, abandonment, helping fugitives. There are even rumors of sorcery." He grinned without any warmth. "Quite a record for such a small woman." Jack stayed silent. The man inclined his head. "We are taking her in. You can either cooperate, or I can make this educational." Then Linda appeared, carrying Jamie on her hip. Her gaze was steady, no hesitation, no begging. She walked up to Jack and simply said, "No." Nothing more. Neither a cry nor a plea, but a firm declaration. The quiet held tension. Suddenly, the man stepped forward, but Jack reacted faster. The butt of his rifle connected with the man's jaw, snapping like a brittle branch, and chaos broke loose. The other riders pulled their weapons. Jack fired once, striking one man in the leg, then dove behind a heap of barrels. Linda set Jamie down carefully, hid him behind the well, and seized the rifle she had concealed under the porch. Smoke and yelling filled the air. Jamie's small shout pierced through like a flare. One assailant tried to circle the cabin, but Linda shot him in the shoulder, knocking him down. A bullet grazed Jack's side, making him stagger briefly, yet he kept firing. At that moment, the fire began. A lantern, knocked over during the chaos, caught on the edge of the barn. Flames surged upward as if they had been waiting for this moment. The horses cried out, and the clearing filled with thick smoke. Linda dashed toward the well, grabbed Jamie, then turned to see Jack Miller on his knees, blood streaming from his thigh, while the lead rider loomed over him, aiming a revolver directly at his forehead. She did not hesitate. She did not aim carefully. She just screamed and fired the gun. The bullet struck the man's neck. He fell silently, blood splattering on the stone beneath him. Jack collapsed backward, struggling to breathe. The other men scattered in all directions, carrying the injured, leaving behind the flames and the fallen. Linda dropped the firearm and rushed to him. He was barely conscious, his teeth clenched. One hand pressed firmly against the rapidly bleeding wound. She tore off his belt, tied it tightly above the injury, and pressed cloth into the hole. He said nothing, only watched her with the same calm resoluteness he had when teaching her to read the wind. She whispered, "Stay with me." He blinked once. She said it again, "Do not leave." Jamie then awkwardly crawled into Jack's lap, small arms wrapping around his ribs. Jack made a sound, unclear if it was a groan, a laugh, or something in between. Linda looked at them both and understood there would be no one else coming. No doctor, no lawman, no rescuer, only them. So she dragged him inside, lit a fire, boiled water, and did whatever was necessary. She stitched the injury, using strands of her own hair pulled from a comb, and squeezed his hand whenever the trembling became unbearable. Jack Miller remained silent. He did not scream or cry out, yet once, during a sudden fever surge, he barely whispered a single word. "Stay." And she stayed. For 72 hours, she did not close her eyes to rest. With one hand, she fed Jamie, and with the other, she gently cooled Jack's overheated forehead. When the fourth day arrived, the fever finally subsided. As Jack's eyes opened and he noticed her curled up beside him, gripping Jamie protectively as if he were a guardian, he weakly extended his shaking hand and laid it gently on the boy's back. There were no promises exchanged, no pledges made, only a simple touch, only a shared presence. And for them, that meant the world. When the snow returned once more, gentler this time without harshness, the cabin remained intact. The barn had disappeared, its frame charred and buried beneath fresh ashes, yet the house persisted. Walls mended, roof covered with rough wooden shingles, and windows fitted with glass salvaged from a closed church that Jack Miller had once helped. Restore long ago when he still believed that hard work could atone for sins. Now it represented something completely different. Not a stronghold, not a sanctuary. Simply a place offering warmth throughout the night and quiet that did not judge. Jack moved with more caution these days, his leg constantly reminding him, growing stiffer whenever the cold wind blew, but he kept moving. He cared for the fire with a tenderness previously reserved only for weapons. He crafted a new cradle from pine he had dried himself, smoother than the first one, molded not out of urgency but with slow patience. Jamie had started speaking in fragments, peculiar mixtures of sounds and meanings, some influenced by Linda's gentle tone, others clipped like the way Jack commanded a stove or a mule. The boy ran in uneven circles, stumbled often, but always laughed when he stood, his endurance a kind of rebellion all on its own. Sarah had transformed as well. She no longer glanced nervously behind her while chopping wood. Once a month, she strode into town with her head held high, jaw firmly clenched, Jamie cradled on her hip, daring anyone to oppose her. No one did. Not anymore. Jack Miller had disappeared, with some claiming he had fled the entire county. The others fell silent. There were no arrests, no court cases. Too much blood had stained those mountains for any law to take hold. Instead, murmurs gradually faded away. Fear shifted its focus. What remained, like a lingering mist after a blaze, was a peculiar form of respect. Not fondness nor trust. Something weightier. The kind of burden a community places on things it cannot fully grasp but knows better than to confront. That winter, Jack started teaching Sarah how to read correctly. Not just simple names or signs, but complete sentences, dense paragraphs, old account ledgers, and worn storybooks that had somehow survived both harsh weather and conflict. At first, she read slowly, her lips barely moving, her finger tracing each word as if navigating through foreign land. But she was quick to learn. Before long, she no longer needed assistance. Instead, she read aloud to Jamie in the evenings, her voice calm and steady, weaving tales from pages written for lives unlike their own, yet somehow still resonant and true. One evening, as snow silently fell against the windows and the fire barely crackled in the fireplace, Sarah read aloud from a children's primer about a boat crossing a river and a man who gave his coat to a child. When she finished, she glanced over and saw Jack Miller asleep. Not slumped over, not collapsed, but resting calmly with his arms folded and one boot still partly unlaced, as if he intended to rise again soon, but simply forgot. Jamie lay curled up at his feet. She did not disturb either of them. She just set the book down and quietly observed their steady breathing. Their life was not filled with happiness, yet it was a life made by choice, and for them, that was everything in the world. Later, during the early days of spring, Jack placed a stone at the edge of the field. It bore no name and no date, just an engraving of a crow in mid-flight, its wings fully spread, carved deeply into the granite. When Sarah inquired about it, he replied, "Not everything must be spoken aloud to be remembered." She nodded, understanding clearly. Years went by, but the mountain held their memory. Travelers told tales of a man who walked with a limp and a girl who could shoot better than most men. Of a boy who once never cried, but now sang to goats and gave names to the wind. Some claimed the cabin had been a fortress. Others insisted it had been a prison. But those who lingered long enough, those who noticed the garden Sarah tended and the porch Jack repaired every spring, shared a different story. They said it was a new beginning. and that was enough.